Bocock. I'm the independent chair of the inquiry into the Sheffield street tree dispute. Thank you for joining us. Could I ask you please to tell us your name and your role?
Yes, I'm James Henderson. I'm the Director of Policy, Performance and Communications for the Council.
Great, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate you coming to have this discussion with me. I'm just going to say a couple of things that I say to everybody who comes to these discussions, which I think you're aware of, but just to be transparent and clear. And firstly, this is being recorded and live streamed and will be made available to people to watch later, and you understand that and you're okay with that. And secondly, we have to be careful in these sessions that we don't accidentally say anything which is libelous or defamatory to anybody or about anybody. I'm not expecting us to run into that problem, but just to be aware, as I've said to everybody, if I do get concerned that we may be heading in that direction, I will flag it to you. And if we can't solve the problem, then in extremis, we would have to pause or stop the hearing. And you understand that as well? Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. I've sent you a while ago a list of topics that I was keen to hear your perspective on, and I'd like to work through those with you. But I wonder if there's anything before we get into that you would like to say by way of introductory remarks.
No, I think we'll probably cover everything as we go through the topics you've suggested. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So could you just start, because you've been here working in the Council for a while, by just summarising for me the positions you've had, especially since 2008?
Yes, so I joined the Council in 2004 and have done a variety of roles. In fact, I left for a little while and then came back. By September 2008, I was the Council's Strategy and Research Manager, which is a position I held until June 2009. I was then appointed to the position of the Director of Policy, Partnership and Research from June 2009 to April 2013, and then from April 2013 onwards I've been the Director of Policy, Performance and Communications. There were some slight shifts in responsibility during that period, but that's the role I have held. It might be helpful for me just briefly to outline the various functional responsibilities that I have as part of my area of work as they relate to the street trees dispute. So, as part of that role, I'm responsible for communications, which includes campaigns, press and PR, and external affairs, amongst other things. I'm also responsible for the Council's overall approach to engagement and consultation, for performance analysis and intelligence, which will become relevant in relation to the independent tree panel process, and indeed also for the policy support that was provided to the Council scrutiny committees, which obviously undertook a review of the work on the Western Road War Memorial trees, which we may pick up as we go through.
Excellent, thank you very much indeed. One thing you were not directly responsible for, though, was the detailed design and day-to-day operation of the Streets Ahead programme, but you do have an unusually good overview and history, I think, of the issues that I'm looking into. And so I just wonder, from the perspective you have, what you think, with the benefit of hindsight, might have been done differently in the design phase?
Yes. So, as you say, hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I wasn't involved in the design or the delivery of the programme itself. So, all I can really give is some reflections and impressions, and that is at a distance of some considerable time now. So, I will set out, to the best of my knowledge, what I believe to be a sort of a faithful recollection of the events. But a lot has happened since then, and my memory will be fallible. So, there's you need to take that into account, I think. So I have some memory of the very earliest days of the discussion about the potential for making a bid for a share of the PFI credits that have been made available by the government. And at that time, I think, as others may have said to you, Sheffield had a reputation for being a pothole city. The state of the roads, much of the other infrastructure within the city, such as street lighting, gullies, pavements, etc., left much to be desired, really, following many years, if not decades, of underinvestment. And that underinvestment extended to the street tree stock as well. And it was known that a very large proportion of the highways trees that had been planted had been planted at a similar point in the years either side of the war, and were now coming to the end of their natural lives. And for some of those trees, that was very much a here and now issue. For others, it was something that was going to affect them over the next 5, 10, 15 years, but certainly in the reasonably short term. As a council, we were regularly criticised by residents, by businesses, about the state of the highways in the city. And I know that's something that elected members were concerned about, and they wanted to take steps to improve. And my memory is that both officers and members from all parties actually believed that improving the state of the highways was a very important public policy goal. And I don't think that was actually something that was ever particularly disputed by the protesters. And that's an important point, I think, because the dispute was really about how that public policy goal might be achieved, rather than the question of whether or not it should be achieved at all. That should, but in the end didn't, have made this a rather easier dispute to resolve than it turned out actually to be. So there was an opportunity that came up to bid for PFI credits. I wasn't involved in the design and development of that bid, which was of course ultimately successful, but I do remember that there was general delight across the city, both within the council and outside it, when it became clear that we had been successful in that process. There were no other games in town. This was really the only route that was open to us to be able to achieve the level of investment that we needed to radically improve the state of the highway in the city. And before I come on to say what I think might have been possible to do differently, I think it's also important to say that in the first years of the Streets Ahead programme, it was really marked by widespread enthusiasm for the work. There was very little, if any, really, controversy about what was happening, with the complaints that we did receive more about the pace at which the programme was progressing, and some questions about why, as it now seems somewhat ironic, why street trees have been retained in place. So residents actually asking for us to go further than perhaps was in the contract specification. However, there's very little focus at that point on the street trees element, either internally or externally, and in those early days, I don't think there was really very much to give an indication of what was to come later on. It's important to say as well that the programme was designed in such a way that it was phased, so it was approached on an area-by-area basis across the city, with much of the south and southwest of the city, which, as we know, became the real flashpoint during the protests, left to the end of the programme. And that's an important point, I think, because it perhaps, and I'll come on to say a little bit more about this later, it limited the council's room for manoeuvre. But to answer your question, in terms of what could have been done differently at the time the contract was agreed, I think with the benefit of hindsight, undoubtedly there are things that it might have been possible to do differently. So there might, for instance, have been the ability to vary the contract to take into account the views and wishes of local residents about how the goals of the programme might best be achieved on their streets, in their areas, and there might have been an opportunity for greater levels of consultation about those individual proposals for streets than was envisaged at the time that the programme was developed. There might have been different standards built into the programme, or the opportunity for different standards built in regarding things like curb lines or other aspects of what became the contract specification. And there might have been the possibility of engineering the contract differently, so that not all of the upgrade work needed to fall within what became the core investment period. And I think if we were designing a similar contract now, and actually the kind of the vogue for PFI is not what it was in those days, with the benefit of knowledge of the knowledge that we now have, those are things that we would almost certainly be looking to build in. I think my counterpoint to that, though, would be whether those options were really knowable to us back in 2008 when the contract was being drawn up. I wasn't involved in it, but I think it's highly unlikely, actually, that anyone at that point in time would have been able to imagine or foresee the sorts of issues and the consequences that would arise. And I don't know, therefore, that there was in reality any opportunity to approach it any differently. All of those changes that I've just mentioned, or all of those different ways of approaching it, would have added cost, they would have added risk to the programme, and even if they have been suggested, I'm not sure that I can see any world in which they might have been seriously entertained as being necessary or proportionate, given the near universal view that there was that the city's highways needed major investment to renew them and to bring them up to the standard that politicians, public, businesses, others thought was necessary at that point.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very thoughtful and insightful and impressive answer to my question, but I do, there's one point that you've not touched on that I want just to follow up on, because I have received evidence from a number of sources, from the business community, from trade union officials, actually from middle managers working in the city council, to the effect that there was a concern in 2012, at the time the contract was signed, that the approach being envisaged for, as you referred to it, Southwest Sheffield, was going to run into trouble. And that was not exposed in the business case, in the risk assessment, and in the other preparatory work, and there wasn't very much consultation with the kind of bodies that would have exposed that risk. So I wanted just to ask you whether, again with the benefit of hindsight, there was anything in the design methodology which might have led to that problem which people have told me they forecast back in 2012 to have been surfaced more effectively.
I mean, that's not something I've got direct knowledge of, and as I say, I wasn't particularly or really at all involved in that back in those days. So in terms of how the programme was designed at that point in time and the consultation, kind of formal or informal, that went on with different stakeholders, I wasn't particularly exposed to. I mean, I think, as I've said, there was clearly a deliberate choice, and I don't know the reasons for this, about the phasing of the programme, and the fact that the south and the southwest of the city came last. And I do wonder, looking back on it now, as to whether that choice about phasing was potentially whether that was that choice was made because of some of those concerns, and that there might have been a sense that moving on some of the areas of the city where those issues were less likely to crop up, and to demonstrate the benefits of the programme, might make the works in the southwest of the city easier when it came to it. That's somewhat speculative on my part, but clearly I think if we were approaching a programme like this now, that we would want to hear from as wide a range of stakeholders as possible, both internally within the council, so talking to our managers, talking to our staff who were on the ground, who had knowledge of these things about how they might play out, including through what have now been established as a local area committees, so trying to understand how some of those issues might play out on an area by area basis, but also with others within the city, businesses, trade unions, whoever. I don't know the extent to which that happened. I wasn't part of that, but I think if we were approaching it now, that's certainly something we would want to try to do.
Okay, very good indeed. Thank you very much indeed. As you said, it wasn't evident to the council how views were building up in certain parts of the city in 2012, 2013, 2014, but by 2015 it was evident that there were some problems arising. So I wanted to ask you about advice you gave in 2015 around managing reputational risks and the approach being adopted by some of your colleagues on that within the place portfolio of the council structure at the time.
Yeah. So I first became involved in the street trees issue at some point in 2015. I can't recall exactly when. I'd probably been becoming gradually aware that there were some emerging issues before that, but I think at that point there were issues that were very largely, as you say, being dealt with or managed from within the programme, and by which I mean across Amy and the Highways client team within the council, and the Highways client team form part of the place portfolio. My service, which included the communications function, had an embedded communications officer within the Highways client team. That was something that was set up at the outset of the contract to provide dedicated communications resource to the programme, and through that mechanism, through that embedded officer, I became aware of some of those issues that were beginning to emerge at that point in time. And I think there was some fairly localised disquiet that was beginning to arise with trees. I think the first one I actually became aware of was in Stocksbridge, and then I think there was an issue with a new bus lane that was being planned that required the removal of a number of trees. But I wouldn't say that I gave any particular attention to Streets Ahead as a programme or as a potential issue before 2015. That changed really with Rustings Road Mark 1, if I can call it that, in 2015, when the Amy teams attempted to remove and replace trees on that road and were unsuccessful following the efforts of a group of local residents who became, and may already have been at that point, I think known as Save Our Rustings Trees, and were later affiliated to Stag. Councillor Terry Fox was the cabinet member responsible at that point and attempted, rightly in my view, to initiate a process of some more direct communication and discussion with residents and campaigners through something that was known as the Highways Trees Advisory Forum, to help explain the work, explain the council's intention behind it, and to help resolve some of those emerging issues. I became involved as it was becoming apparent that the communications approach we'd adopted to that point was insufficient. It was far too reactive, and I wrote a briefing note, which I believe you've got a copy of, which set out my concerns at that point and my thoughts on how that position might be changed. And it said that our strategy and tactics around the trees replacement programme, and in particular the protests that were focused around Rustings Road, were unclear, and that was leading to a reactionary and largely unplanned communications response with the potential to cause significant local and possibly national reputational harm to the authority. And I said at that point that we needed to agree quickly a robust and defensible position on this issue that we can communicate with confidence. Within that note, I began to set out a number of subsidiary points or issues that needed to be addressed. And I think this was at a point where I probably didn't have an awful lot of knowledge of the contract and some of the repercussions and implications of kind of changing things. But what I did say was that there seemed to be little appetite within the Highways client team at that point to explore any alternative options to the original programme. I wasn't clear at that point, I think, why that was, but it seemed to me to come down to a mixture of worries about the funding pressures and funding profile, some concerns about setting unhelpful precedents, the risk of taking one-off decisions that were later hard to defend, and perhaps a bit of a rigid adherence to the agreed policy. There was a linked point, I think, that I felt that Councillor Fox, as the lead cabinet member, had asked the Highways client team to explore some alternative options and to bring forward some proposals about what might be done differently. I didn't get a sense that that request had been responded to particularly positively, and that there was nothing that could really be done to change things as they stood. So I had a real sense that Councillor Fox had tried to lead a slightly different way of approaching this, but that perhaps hadn't been followed through by the service, and I thought that there was some resentment on an operational level that the plan was being challenged by members, by campaigners, or indeed by anybody else. I thought the communications response, as I said today, had probably been not as it should have been, and quite reactionary and quite driven by programme requirements to keep work on track without adequately taking into account the wider strategic reputational harm that could ensue as a result. And that had been manifested in the establishment of the Trees Forum, which I think there was some clear evidence at that point that the campaigners viewed that as something that was perhaps a bit of a sham, and that it appeared that the council was paying lip service. I don't think that was the intention of it, but I think that was how it was beginning to be perceived, and that didn't really fit with our aspirations for the council's values and behaviours at that point, about being what we described as an in-touch organisation. There were a number of other points which I won't go through in detail, but what I did say is that waiting things out, as opposed to sort of trying to address some of these issues head on, did not appear to be working, and if anything it was giving the campaign more momentum, and that there was a real risk, and I said this in the note, that it will spread beyond Rustings Road and some of the other sort of point areas of the city to other parts, particularly in the south and southwest of Sheffield. And I said it's also harming our ability to successfully promote other work that the council's doing, including some of the work that we were doing at that point on the outdoor city plan that we were trying to take through. So looking back now, it's really a matter of considerable personal regret to me that those issues weren't acted upon at the time. I think Councillor Fox had rightly identified some of those same risks, but there's a clear sense that they weren't really being addressed. And I went on in the advice note to suggest a series of steps that we might take to ameliorate some of those issues that were set out, and they included having a clear set of principles centred around openness and transparency, making sure that we were listening to the views and ideas that might come forward, wherever they might come from actually, and giving enough time and space for residents to fully engage with the issues and constraints we had. And that included changing our communications approach, finding a different role for the Highways Trees Advisory Forum. And it was also in that note that we began to sort of explore whether there would be the potential for some form of street-by-street gathering of public opinion, which later, of course, came to be one of the key planks of the independent tree panel process. And the note identified a number of risks and issues that might arise from such an approach, including our ability to successfully complete the Streets Ahead programme, and a bit of a risk of being seen as potentially a bit weak or capitulating to the demands of what was then quite a small group of campaigners. But it was an approach that sought to put managing the reputational risk of the trees element of the Streets Ahead programme at its heart. And also leaving the protest unchecked, and considering what options we might have in response to that. And that never really kind of gained a lot of traction, and wasn't where we ended up, where the approach was much closer, particularly during 2016 and 2017, to thinking about how we manage the operational and programme risks and seeing the reputational issues as a bit subsidiary to that. I will say, though, that hindsight, again, is a really wonderful thing. There were lots of different voices at this point. We didn't know how big an issue this was going to be. There was probably a feeling that some of the things that I was talking about in that note were a bit of an overreaction to what seemed quite a localised issue at that point. And that if we'd gone down the road of the suggestions that I've made, that they might set some really unhelpful precedents, and might cause us more problems in terms of our ability to make the progress that the Council wanted to see in terms of the Streets Ahead programme. So I think it needs. It's important that there was a sense that there were different views and different perspectives. Nevertheless, there were aspects of what I did suggest that then did later go on to be implemented, including the tree panel process, as I think we'll go on to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. But again, that was a very helpful and comprehensive answer, and you were flagging the danger of a reputational risk to the Council at a national level, and observing a variety of different views, and encouraging people to think in a different way about the set of issues they were facing. So in many ways what you were saying then turned out to be rather prescient, I think it would be fair to say. Let's move on then to what I guess you might refer to as the second stage or phase of the Rustlings Road set of issues. You talked about what happened in 2015, and essentially the Council delayed and bought time by the approach it took in 2015, but then moved forward in the way that everyone now knows in November 2016. When did you first hear about what had happened then, and what are your reflections, again with the benefit of hindsight, on how that operation was implemented and received?
Yeah. So I think it's important to state that the general concept of the second phase of Rustlings Road wasn't a surprise to me. So it was something that I knew was going to happen at some point. It was fairly well known, I think, within the Council that at some point there was going to have to be a second attempt to remove the trees on Rustlings Road, given that by that point there hadn't been any major change in strategy around the implementation of the programme. There were some planning meetings led, I believe, by senior officers in the place portfolio and involving Amy as to how that might be done. I didn't attend any of those, but the communications officers in my team did, and it was during one of those meetings that where the communications officer was informed that neither she nor anyone else in the communications team were going to be made aware of any of the precise operational details about the plan until after it was executed. That resulted in an email, which I believe is in the archive, setting out her objections to the exclusion of the communications team from that planning process, and the risks that the authority was running by so doing. That email was then summarised in a further email from a manager in the comms team to me, to the head of communications and to the chief executive, setting out their concerns. Again, that email is also in the archive and identifies this correctly, as it turned out, as the biggest reputational issue that we would face that year, and the decision to exclude the communications team from details of the operational planning she described as crackers, and although that probably wouldn't have been the word that I would have chosen to use, I think that actually seems pretty justified by the way things proceeded. I remember at that point being extremely concerned by where this was heading, and I recall raising my concerns with the exec director responsible, but I was unable to get any traction at that point. As it was, therefore, apart from in the very broadest terms, we were pretty unprepared from a communications perspective for what happened on the 17th of November 2016. and the first I and my team knew that the operation had taken place overnight was hearing about it on the news that morning. I think given what I've just said about the concerns that we voiced in the build-up to the operation, it perhaps won't be a huge surprise to learn that I was extremely concerned, and more than a little angry actually, about what happened during the early hours of that day. It was very far from ideal from a communications perspective in terms of how we were able to respond on that day, late and without all the facts to hand. Councillor Brian Lodge, who was the cabinet member by that point, did, in my view, an admirable job of being the face and the voice of the council on that and on subsequent days, but he had an extremely difficult job to do given what had taken place and the light that it placed the council in. More than that, though, it caused the council and the city immense damage, and in my view placed us completely on the back foot. We lost a great deal of public sympathy at that point, because I think even if people agreed with the principle, of the Streets Ahead programme, the manner of how we approached Rustlings Road was, in the eyes of very many people in the city, simply wrong. And one of the other byproducts of the Rustlings Road operation was that I think we effectively sealed the fate of the Independent Trees panel at that point. We published their advice and our decisions following that advice, which were very largely to decline to follow their recommendations, except, we declined to follow their recommendations where they differed from our original proposals. So that advice was published along with our decisions on that in the small hours of the morning just before the operation commenced. We also failed to brief the chair of the panel in advance about the operation and about the publication of his advice, which seemed to me to be discourteous at best to him. Of course, we did later apologise publicly for the Rustlings Road operation, but in my view we lost a great deal of public credibility on that day and gave the campaign groups a significant boost. And there's an email I wrote to the Chief Executive the day after that operation, which is also in the archive, which I think sets out in some more detail the concerns I had, and which I think you've seen.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. That's all very clear again. In the light of that, how did your views evolve on how the programme could or should proceed? I know, in particular, in 2018, you reminded people, to quote you, quote, "Put simply, there's no good picture of older residents being arrested. There's no good way to photograph a tree lying in the street." And you were very concerned about the reputational damage, which you described just now as immense. So how did your views evolve from that point on?
Yeah, so following Rustlings Road, I think there were a few weeks of sort of absorbing what had happened. But I did then write a further note in December of 2016, so approximately a month later, which proposed a plan for how we might proceed at that point. I mean, it was focused, as you say, very, very heavily on the reputational damage that was being caused. And if you don't mind, it might just be helpful for me to quote from some of it. So I said with the Rustlings Road operation, the City Council has been through an extremely difficult period over the last few weeks. Our reputation has been damaged as a result. There have been a large number of what I described as hostile stories in the local, regional and national media and on social media. There have been demonstrations, protests, there were questions in Parliament about the approach we have adopted. My view at that point was that although that reputational damage was clearly severe, it wasn't necessarily irreparable, and taken as a whole, it remained a hugely positive programme of investment for the city that the whole city would benefit from, and that should give us a platform from which to build from. But we weren't going to regain the trust of the people of Sheffield by just carrying on as we were. And I said that we needed to have a jointly owned, clear and concise forward strategy that we implement carefully and consistently at all times. And we need to try and change the tone of the conversation in the city. And I think the other point that I was careful to make in that note was that we also needed to remember that we were still going through a period of austerity within the council, and that people were under a lot of strain, and that for very many people this wasn't the overriding issue that they were concerned about. So they were concerned about the money they had in their pockets, about the quality of the schools that their children attended, about health and care services, and so we needed to maintain a balance that we didn't allow ourselves to become sort of completely overwhelmed by the street trees issues, but we needed to recognise that many people in the city were extremely passionate about the street trees and about the way in which that part of the Streets Ahead programme was being progressed. So I said that we needed to have a strategy that consisted of 4 main aims, and I think this is really an evolution of the approach that I talked about back in 2015. And those 4 aims were firstly that residents should trust us when we talk to them about our plans for roadside trees in their areas and understand why we're proposing what we're planning to do. Secondly, residents should feel that their views matter in this process and that they're taken into account before decisions are made, and that we need to demonstrate to the people and communities of the city that we've learned from the mistakes that we've made in the Rustings Road incident. Thirdly, that the people of Sheffield should believe that we respect and want to protect and preserve the city's green infrastructure, including our roadside trees, and that the people of Sheffield should recognise the improvements that we're making as a result of the Streets Ahead investment, and take increased pride in their city and their neighbourhood as a result. And I said that those aims were interlocking and mutually reinforcing, and in particular we were unlikely to achieve the 3rd and 4th of those aims without making progress on the first 2. None of those were focused on the protest groups themselves, and I think we recognised at that point that they were likely to be the most difficult of the groups to convince of what we're doing. But by making progress towards all 4 of those aims, we should be able to reduce the profile and prominence of some of the issues around street trees. So I said that we needed to have a broad approach that was about demonstrating in every word and deed our determination to do what we said we were going to do, and that covered everything from publishing the ITP results and fully explaining our response to them, to ensuring that we keep our promises about the start times for operations, and that meant following the spirit as well as the letter of our promises. And I think there was perhaps kind of prior to that a rather sort of rigid interpretation of this is what we've said and this is exactly how we're going to follow it through, and that we needed to be thinking about the spirit of things a bit more than we perhaps had done. We needed to identify early any potential flashpoints, so there are a number of what now kind of famous roads, Rustings Road, Aberdale Park, Rise, the Mearsbrook Park Road as well. So we needed to identify those potential flashpoints and take positive steps to reduce, mitigate, or ideally to reverse any potential reputational issues that came with that, and that we should never be in a position of reacting to something that's caught us unawares, and that we needed to have a planned programme of positive, mutually reinforcing content, I suppose in the jargon, that demonstrates our commitment to the green infrastructure and heritage of the city. I think it is, though, important that we place that in context. Kind of following Rustings Road, things were extremely difficult on the ground. We'll go on to talk, I think, about how some of those kind of battle lines have been drawn up. The behaviour of the protesters was not good in some instances, and that made things quite difficult as well. And the compromise that we later arrived at in 2018 probably wasn't available to us at that point. So our room for manoeuvre was less than it might have been. I think it's important to say that. I think the other thing that I do want to take an opportunity now to say is that with hindsight, I could and should have pushed more of what I said in that note and subsequently much harder and faster than I was in reality able to do. And as a senior officer in the council, I bear some of the responsibility for what happened, and in particular that ability to bring it to a speedier conclusion and resolution than we were perhaps able to. So I just wanted to place that on record at this point.
Well, thank you for that, James. I want to just ask you about that, though, and one other thing on what you've just said. I wonder whether, in the context of the tone at the time and the nature of the political direction and the perspective of people you were working for and colleagues you had, how feasible it was for you to have done very much more than you did. So you've been rather on the front foot in asking yourself whether you could have done more, but I wonder if there's a little bit too much hindsight there, and whether you'd just like to say a little bit about the tone and culture and nature of the environment at that time. We'll come on to it, but you've raised the issue now, and so I want to give you a chance to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no doubt that there was a particular culture within the organisation at that point. I'll say a bit more about the kind of political perspectives, and I think the politicians had a very clear and reasonable position that they wanted to see the Streets Ahead programme completed. They'd been elected on a manifesto commitment to do that. That was a very clear part of their programme for being in office. They were repeatedly re-elected on that manifesto commitment, and it was a proper and lawful public policy position for them to be pursuing. So I think that's beyond doubt, and I think it's important to recognise that was the broad political environment and policy that we were being asked to pursue. And I don't think anybody had any particular concerns about that. There was a culture within the organisation, and I think particularly within the place portfolio at that time, that was quite, I was going to use the word macho, and I think there probably was a bit of that. There was it was certainly a very determined culture that this was the programme that had been set out, that this was what we were going to deliver, and that we were going to make sure that we did that almost by hook or by crook. And I think that culture was less receptive than it might have been to suggestions from other parts of the organisation or externally about different ways of proceeding. And I think that probably accounted for some of what we later saw. So I agree. I think what I've just said is with the benefit of hindsight, and whether that was in reality available at the time, for even if I had kind of banged the drum harder than I did, whether that would actually have resulted in any different outcome, I simply don't know at this point.
Okay. Now the other thing I wanted just to follow up on was, in your communication strategy, you placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of understanding and responding to what local people, including local residents in areas affected, thought and felt, as opposed to being driven by what, for example, your colleagues in place might have thought local people should have thought and felt. And I wanted to ask if you saw that sort of difference, and if you had any ways of encouraging your colleagues in place to understand the difference between what we think and what local people think.
So I don't know if you're going to cover the independent tree
I'm
panel
going to come on to that in a
process
minute.
In a minute, yes, okay. So I think, I mean, at this remove, I don't recall all of the conversations that we had. I think that I certainly had a sense that there was an opportunity, perhaps, to do a bit more of this with communities rather than to communities. That's not to say that there weren't mechanisms in place to allow for some level of engagement. So there were and I've forgotten what they're called now, but there were a kind of a series of public meetings that took place in local areas. There were tree walks organised. There were tree surveys done of individual trees. There was also the Highways Trees Advisory Forum, as I've mentioned. But I think those things were seen rather more as ways of communicating and asserting the programme of works to communities rather than encouraging views and dialogue, and where there were differences of opinion, thinking about what the mechanisms of compromise that might be open to us were. That wasn't really in the repertoire at that point. Did we do enough thinking corporately about how we might make that happen, how we might make that easier for colleagues in place? I'm not sure that we did, if I'm sort of thinking back and being very honest about it. I think we might have been able to do a bit more in terms of proposing some different mechanisms, some different ways of thinking through how you might engage differently with communities and give them more voice than I think the evidence suggests that they felt that they did and probably did.
Yeah, okay, very good, thank you. Let's come on to the independent tree panel then, and maybe there's a few things I wanted to discuss here with you. I mean, firstly, what you hoped it would achieve, how it was designed, and your reflections on the impact of substantial numbers of its recommendations not being accepted, which you touched on earlier.
So just to sort of, make sure that we've got the timelines right, the idea of the independent tree panel began to take hold, I think, late in 2015, early 2016, so prior to Ruston's Road. And it was when Terry Fox was still the lead cabinet member, although the main bulk of the work took place when Councillor Lodge was cabinet member post May 2016. At that point, I think it seemed clear to all of us, and particularly I think Terry, that the Highways Trees Advisory Forum process was not working and was failing to be a route by which the issues might stand any chance of resolution. And as I've said, I suggested that we needed to sort of think about more of a locally based approach for gaining the views of residents. There was a strong view in the council at that time that the tree campaigners did not speak for the vast majority of people in the city, and nor even the majority of those people in the affected areas. And that it was important for us to get a better picture of public opinion in those areas, and we recognised that there may be some streets where there was genuine concern about the proposals, and that having an independently led and run process to review the plans for those streets in those areas where there was a weight of public opinion to do so would be helpful, and that in turn might lead us to being able to plot a path through the dispute. So, in discussion with Terry Fox, I worked up the idea of what was to become the independent tree panel, and I approached Andy Buck, who was and is a well-known, well-liked, credible figure in the city to be its chair. And Andy was, in the best sense of the word, entirely disinterested in the street trees process, and I think had the confidence of all sides. He took a bit of persuasion to do it, I think it's fair to say, but he was happy to do it and did that role, I believe, very, very diligently. a number of other specialists and lay people were recruited to be members of the trees panel. We initially thought that the tree panel would operate in what you might describe as a desk-based manner, so reviewing the plans for each street, referred to it, although it quite quickly became clear that the only way that they could undertake the task was to undertake field visits to the streets in question. So the broad aims of the ITP were to provide independent, impartial and expert advice on issues relating to roadside trees as part of the Streets Ahead programme, to take into account all available evidence, including the views of local residents, importantly, on proposals for individual streets as part of the Streets Ahead programme, and to provide advice to the City Council as the decision maker about any changes that might be required to proposals and about which aspects of the proposal should go ahead without change. So it was looking at both sides of that. The basic operating procedure for the ITP was that streets where trees were proposed to be removed would be surveyed, with any street where a majority of responses returned were against the proposals would be referred to the ITP for review. And those surveys were designed and implemented by members of my team, working with the Highways client team. I'd like to touch, if I can, just a little bit on the survey methodology, because I'm aware that has been criticised by the campaigners. We were faced with a couple of constraints as we were designing this process. Firstly, it was important that the only people who were able to respond to a survey on a particular street were residents of that street, which meant that a targeted postal survey was really the only option that was open to us. We were also unable, because of data processing law, to use other council databases to address the surveys to named individuals. To enable us to analyse the responses that were received through that process, we strongly encouraged online responses to those postal surveys, which meant that people had to access a website using a printed URL on the letter that we sent them. And what that meant was that the way this proceeded was that we sent letters addressed to the householder through the post with a printed web link for them to access the survey. And that really was quite cumbersome and difficult for some people. And I think that if we'd been able to design a different way of approaching it, that would have been better and would have perhaps encouraged a greater response rate than we were actually able to achieve. Having said that, though, I think that the sheer number of streets that were in the end referred to the ITP, and actually the very low barrier of referrals, so out of a street of say 100 houses, we had 3 responses and 2 were in favour of referring to the ITP and 1 against. That was sufficient for it to be referred to the ITP. I would suggest that in the end that perhaps didn't cause any significant issue with the referral process. So once referred, the ITP then went out and assessed the trees in question on each street, and I believe you've heard evidence from Andy on that. Andy and the team then returned their detailed advice to us in a number of batches. We were clear from the outset the council would remain the decision maker. Indeed, delegating that responsibility to the panel itself would have been unlawful, and that the ITP's advice was simply that. It was advice which could be accepted, partially accepted or rejected. I wasn't part of the decision making process, and I can't say for certain exactly what that process was, except that I am clear that it was an officer process rather than a member-led one, as the decisions on whether to remove and to replace an individual tree were clearly delegated to officers to make. Nevertheless, I had a reasonably clear expectation that, having set the ITP up, that there should be an intention that the council would carefully and diligently consider the advice and give some substantial weight really to the ITP in coming to a final decision for each tree. I certainly think that was in Councillor Fox's mind at the time of the ITP's establishment, and I can't imagine that Andy Buck would have taken on the responsibility of chairing it had he thought that the council wasn't going to give that advice, that he and the rest of the panel took time to provide the proper consideration that it deserved. And I have to say I was impressed at the depth and the care with which the ITP proceeded and the way in which they came to their recommendations. However, I think that, as you've said, the record is clear that very largely the ITP advice was only followed where it agreed with the council's original proposal for a tree. That covered, I believe, something like 65 to 70% of the trees considered, but of course the issues were in the other 30 to 35% where the ITP advice differed from the council's original proposal. Parochially, that caused me and my team quite a communications headache about how we kind of dealt with that outcome from this process. But more broadly, it was another way, I think, in which the campaigners lost confidence in the council's ability to respond to the concerns being put to it by residents. It's impossible to say for certain, again, this is another of these with hindsight comments, I think, but I do believe that if we'd approached the ITP advice with perhaps a little bit more imagination and thought about how their recommendations might have been implemented, then we might have been able to head off some of the protests that then followed. It's likely that that would have been challenging to achieve. Politicians were clear throughout that there should be no additional public money spent on the programme. There were billions of pounds going into this, and they didn't want to see more public money being spent on it. And so, to the extent that the recommendations of the ITP relied on solutions that that were available but were not funded from within the contract, and as an aside, I know that's something that Andy has raised with you as a question. But that would have relied on Amy to fund those solutions, or for the council to put additional funding in, and that would have been quite challenging for us at that point. And I understand that Amy at that point thought that they would still be able to move forward with the programme as it had originally been envisaged during the core investment period. And to be clear, contractually it was for Amy to ensure that the programme was completed successfully, not the council. So, although I think that there was a moment of opportunity to think a bit differently about the ITP recommendations, I'm under no illusions that the room for manoeuvre was fairly limited and that it would have been quite challenging to do that. What I would say is that by that stage, and certainly by the time of Rusting's Road Mark II, I think it was entirely possible to see the likely shape of what lay ahead, and to have considered what a different path might have looked like at that point. And as such, the ITP was, I believe, the last and best chance we had to avoid what came later during 2017 and then into the early part of 2018.
So essentially, your take is not that different from Andy Buck's, that had more of the ITP's recommendations been accepted, there's a chance that would have prevented what followed.
Yes, I think broadly. I haven't done the calculation or got the evidence for this, but I think that if you went out and looked at those trees that have been considered through the street tree partnership process and the individual process of consultation that was put in place following the mediation and establishment of the partnership, I think you'll find probably that quite a number of the trees that the ITP recommended could be retained have in fact now been retained.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I've asked others this question as well, but more broadly, would you like just to give me a summary view on what the wider impact of the council setting up an independent panel on a sensitive issue and then visibly and in some cases, as you've described earlier, rather egregiously, in the case of the precise details of what happened on Rustlings Road, with no notice of the ITP's recommendation what would be done, ignoring what its independent panel said. What do you think the wider consequences of that were on trust and confidence in the council?
Well, it wasn't a good look. It had the, I think, as I've said, I think it rather fatally undermined the trust and confidence that certainly the campaign groups had in the council. We set out to, well, we established the ITP with those set of objectives that I talked through, which included that we should take into account the views of local residents on proposals for individual streets, and I don't think that we stuck to that, and I think that was undermining, and I think it had a broader impact on trust and confidence beyond street trees or even beyond the Streets Ahead programme, and I think it's taken us some considerable time to regain that. It's not entirely about the ITP, it's about some of the other aspects of what happened during this dispute, but it hasn't done anything for the relationship between the council and some of the communities within the city.
Yes, thank you. Now you've touched on this already, and maybe you've said all you want to say on it, but let me just give you a chance to say anything else you'd like to say on the question of how far those responsible in the highways team, basically, the technical client team for the Streets Ahead programme, were receptive to advice or suggestions made by other officers.
So if I can, I would like to say a little bit about this, and I will restrict these observations to the client team themselves rather than the broader officer leadership, which I'll probably come on to in the next question. So I think the first thing to say is that the client team were, in my view, a dedicated, committed group of officers who had a very, very significant task in front of them with the Streets Ahead programme, working with Amy to do so. They were a group of professionals who cared deeply about the highways and the wider street scene and environment of the city. And they were people who had committed their careers to its care and to its improvement. Some might raise an eyebrow at this, but I haven't a shadow of a doubt that they cared deeply about the city's street trees and saw the Streets Ahead programme as a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-career opportunity to ensure that the street tree stock could be revitalised and handed to the next generation in a good shape. And I think they knew that the street tree stock that they had inherited was coming to the end of its life. It was made up of species that were ill-suited for the highway, etc., etc. So I think they saw this as a really significant opportunity, and they cared deeply about maximising that opportunity. I think it's also true to say that they were wholly unprepared and probably ill-equipped for the storm that overtook them. That isn't a criticism of them as a team or indeed as individuals, but I think there was a bit of a, if you'll excuse the expression, a bit of a boiling frog mindset. So the enormity of the challenge that they faced with the campaign and the protests crept up on them, and I believe that there was always a bit of a sense that if they could just get through next week or the next street, then things would begin to improve. The reality was that their main professional concern was rightly the delivery of the programme and not any of the other issues that might be seen as somewhat ancillary, such as the wider impact that it was having on the city. And as such, as a team, I think they found it quite difficult to understand why there might be a view from others that a different approach might be necessary. And as a result, particularly at that sort of middle management level within the client function, there was perhaps not a wholly receptive attitude to the views of non-highway specialists about sort of kind of getting into this debate. I also think it's really important to recognise that members, and sometimes quite junior members of that team, were put through significant and, in my view, wholly unwarranted aggravation and harassment by some of those associated with the campaign, both personally and professionally. And that caused some of those officers real distress, anxiety, and indeed ill health. And the behaviour of some of those associated with the campaign was quite simply not good. And I think it would be wholly remiss of me not to raise that with you today. And I have no doubt that that will have affected the team's ability to be dispassionate about the situation, and I think probably had the impact of kind of strengthening or inculcating that kind of them and us mindset, which I think was ultimately a barrier to being able to resolve the situation, but I think was also understandable in the circumstances in which they found themselves, and which some of those, not all by any means, but some of those associated with the campaign put them in.
Okay, thank you. Now, what you've just said there about the understandable thought process, if you like, of managerial staff in the client team raises the question of the effectiveness of oversight, executive oversight, by more senior staff. I've heard evidence referring to groupthink. I've heard some reflections from the former chief executive on whether at times top management should have intervened in a different way. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to say about that set of issues and the nature of engagement of the most senior officers.
Yeah. If I can, I'd like to start by explaining the structure of the council at that point in time and the roles of the senior officers involved. So the council was split into three large, what are known as portfolios. The highways function was part of the place portfolio, which was headed by an executive director who reported to the chief executive. And underneath the executive director, there were a number of directors, each responsible for a particular area of responsibility. The highways team actually moved between different directors' areas during the course of the Streets Ahead programme, but it was during the entirety of that period headed by a head of highways who reported to the relevant director. The other portfolios were people portfolio and resources included finance and legal and governance. My own area, policy, performance and communications, was not part of any portfolio but was aligned to resources, but my post reports and reported at the time directly to the chief executive. So that hopefully just gives a bit of a sort of an overview of how the structures worked. So you can see therefore that between the head of highways and the chief executive there were two layers of management, both very senior roles in the organisation, and who had responsibility and accountability for the Streets Ahead programme and indeed the broader highways responsibility of the local authority. Amongst, it has to be said, very many other important services. So during the period in question there were two individuals who held the executive director role for place, and there were three directors, although the middle of those three was only there on an interim basis, but those three directors had responsibility for the highways function during the period in question. One of the things looking back that I find surprising is how little the involvement of the first two directors in this whole dispute was. Those two individuals were in post as the campaign began to gain momentum and during the time of the Rustlings Road operation. And it was only really when Paul Billington came into post that there was any real director level leadership of the issue. And this absence of leadership at the early stages of the dispute meant that I don't think that there was anybody sufficiently engaged in the issues who was able and equipped to take that step back and think strategically about how those might be resolved, or to think about what options or solutions there might be. By the time Paul Billington came into post, the pattern of the dispute had become established, and it was, as we saw, rather difficult to move towards consensus building. I think you're going to cover the mediation process in a minute, so I'll say more about how the political and officer leadership in the shape of Paul at that point contributed to the eventual resolution of the dispute. But even when Paul was in post, there was, as far as I can recall, almost no involvement whatsoever in any aspect of the dispute from the executive director responsible, who was Paul's line manager, and that does strike me now as being remarkable, really. Leading on from that, one of the things that you might ask is the extent to which the trees issue was discussed within the senior officer leadership meetings of the council as the protest grew and became a national and indeed international reputational issue for the authority and the city. The answer is surprisingly little. What happened in practice was that the management of the programme and the response to the campaign was very largely contained within the place portfolio, with the engagement of legal and communication support and advice at various points. That was perhaps understandable, I think, in the early days of the dispute, when the extent of the disquiet was becoming slowly apparent, but that very largely carried on right through, so right through the 3.5 years to the point of the mediation process. And I think, in hindsight, that does appear less than ideal. It is true, though, to say that the council was dealing with myriad other challenges at that point, and there were significant issues, including a major programme of cuts, as I've already alluded to, resulting from the austerity that we were facing. It was right and proper that the trees protest didn't engulf the whole organisation and didn't distract the authority from doing what it needed to on those other issues. But I think the fact that there was so little opportunity for collective conversation and some constructive challenge about what other options might be available to us meant that a very particular sort of pattern of thought was allowed to develop and was left unchecked and unchallenged for too long. The potential for other possibilities or course of action, I think, was probably a bit closed off as a result. And one of the things that again strikes me looking back on it now was that I don't think until the point of mediation that we really sought external views or advice from other authorities or from the local government association or from any other body that might have been able to come in and take a step back and to help us to kind of think through what our options were and to give us a bit of a view about what was going on. That sort of process didn't happen, certainly as far as I can recall, during any of the years from sort of 2015 through to 2018. So the pattern of thought that began to develop as a result of that was largely constrained to the Highways client team and certainly within the place portfolio. And it was one that I guess you could describe as being a bit of an attritional approach to the protest. So by taking whatever steps as could be thought of to allow work to proceed on the streets on a street by street basis. By doing that, the view was that Amy would be able to complete the core investment period of the programme, by which point the main works would have taken place. And I think it was hoped that the campaigns and the protests would begin to sort of die away at that point. That meant Amy responding to new tactics from the protesters by new counter-tactics of their own. And as time went on, those tactics and counter-tactics, as we know, became more and more severe and resulted, as we know, in the court cases, the injunctions and committal hearings, as well as the campaign tactics around geckoing and oversailing and depot stakeouts, which I know you've heard from others about. But I think what it did mean is that we ended up in a very sort of black and white mindset. So broadly a view within the council that the protesters were unable to grasp the benefits of the programme, that they were in the wrong, we were in the right, which left us less and less space, if you like, to be able to find ways of bridging the ground between the two. And I think in reverse, actually, that was probably as much the case for the protesters as it was for the council and Amy during those really hard days in 2016, 2017. So as well as the siloed nature of the decision making and the lack of strategic leadership, I'd like to add in a few more reasons why I think some of this took as long to resolve as it did. I've already talked about the culture in the place portfolio at the time, which I think did favour persevering with the planned work, and which was less willing than it might have been to consider the case for alternatives. Secondly, I think that the politics of the dispute, it was quite hard for officers to engage with that. And what do I mean by that? As I've said, there were some very clear political red lines all the way through this. The Streets Ahead programme was a manifesto commitment from the majority group, the Labour group on the council, and they wanted to see that continue with the whole city benefiting from the investment and the improved street scene that was going to arise from it, but also that there should be no additional public money spent on engineering or other solutions that were not included within the contractual provisions of the programme. As I've said, that was an entirely proper political position to take, but as I've said, the only way out of that would have been for the costs of suboptimal solutions to the highways issues to be borne by Amy, which is of course what happened in 2018, but was more difficult to achieve than it might otherwise have looked at the outset. Thirdly, and I said earlier that I think the phasing issue probably had an impact as well. What I mean by that is that most of the rest of the city had already seen the upgrade work take place, and politically it became very hard to countenance a view that there should be a different approach, and a more expensive approach actually, for one part of the city that had happened to come last in the phasing. And I think those political lines became clearer during the period from 2015 to early 2018, with the prospect of meaningful dialogue becoming more and more distant during that period as the protests became more and more divisive. And I'm not sure that the officers involved, and I would include myself in this, were equipped to be able to support the politicians to break that logjam as well. But of those, the most important thing, in my view, was the lack of appropriate officer leadership through those early phases of the dispute.
Right.
And there's a bit of a rule of thumb that we sometimes talk about, kind of in terms of good governance, that good decision making in local authority happens when there is that healthy balance between political leadership, between technical officer leadership and strategic officer leadership. And looking back now, that balance was anything but healthy during that period, with that strategic officer leadership that should have been focused on the resolution of and recovery from the dispute largely absent, certainly until the point that Paul came into post a bit later on.
Okay.
Sorry, that's a very long
No,
answer.
that's very, very helpful indeed. Thank you. This is an invaluable conversation. It might take us a little bit longer to finish than I'd anticipate. I'm just going to ask my team to tip off my next invitee that we may overrun a little bit. I just want to ask you one thing which follows from what you've said, really, which is about lessons from all this for the way the council thinks about managing extremely large, potentially controversial programmes into the future. Do you have any sort of takeaways or thoughts about that in the light of what you've just said?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects of this. There's a technical operational piece about how we manage these programmes, and what I would say is that the programme as a whole, from a technical perspective, was and is pretty well managed. There's a good grip on the progress that Amy are making. There's always seemed to me to be a healthy and appropriately challenging relationship between Amy and the council on the delivery of the core elements of the programme, sort of setting aside sort of what happened during the dispute itself. And as an authority, we'd learned quite a lot from previous outsource arrangements about how to structure and manage those sorts of contracts. So, for example, on waste management, where we also have an outsource arrangement. But what none of those arrangements had was the sort of public controversy that accompanied the street trees element of the Streets Ahead programme. And that was the bit that I think we were kind of ill-equipped to manage to have mechanisms in place to enable us to manage that. I think it's fair to say that there have been a number of lessons learned as a result of what happened with all of this. I've already touched on some of the issues as we just discussed of senior officer leadership. I think the other point that I would make is around the internal governance of the programme. So there was, I believe, a Streets Ahead programme board that met and some regular senior level liaison meetings with Amy. But I don't think there was a very clear route for any issues to be escalated from that programme level governance through to a broader conversation within the authority about how that needed to be, how that could be resolved, and to bring different voices into that. And I think having that sort of escalation or pressure valve is really important, and were we to enter into any sort of similar arrangement in the future, it would be important that was in place. And I think for other big programmes of work that we are undertaking at the moment, so for example some of the city centre regeneration work through the Heart of the City 2 programme, I think we have got those governance arrangements that are in a much better state than they were at that point for the Streets Ahead programme. I think the other point I would make here about how we manage these large and complex programmes is that it's quite easy for them to become quite technocratic and to lose the views and perspectives of those who are going to be directly impacted and we would hope benefit from the results of those programmes. And I think there was, looking back on it now, a bit too much of a doing to and not enough of a doing with attitude that was adopted, and that might have been caused by some of the sort of the contractual restrictions that were placed around this and the sort of contractual framework within which we were operating. But it seemed very important to me that including a bit more opportunity for the voice of those who are going to be impacted is really very important in terms of our management of those programmes in the future.
Very good, thank you. Now, in early 2018, you played an important role, I think. It's clear to me from the documentation I've seen in developing ideas for a solution and coming forward with proposals for mediation. And I wanted to ask you how your thinking developed really up to the point where in early March 2018 you wrote a paper and gave a paper to a small number of people with a set of proposals for resolving the dispute, including a mediation proposal. And, you know, I don't think you woke up one bright morning in March 2018 and thought over the tea and cornflakes, okay, I'm going to pop into work and write a paper on mediation. I think there'd been a thought process, and I want to invite you to talk to me about that.
Yeah, so I think probably as we've discussed, and as you've just said, this is something that had been sort of brewing for some time, and I think at the outset I don't want to take all the credit for this at all. I think it was probably, I mean, even as far back as sort of 2015 and 2016, I think we could see that there was going to need to be some mechanism to enable some sort of resolution to this. And I think that the idea of mediation had been floating around in various circles, both within the council and I think probably also within the campaign groups, that mediation, or at least some process of dialogue and discussion and finding some sort of compromise, might well be something that, well, it was likely to be the only route to getting things resolved. And I think that was particularly the case as it became apparent to everyone, and including Amy, I think, that just trying to sort of bulldoze through with the planned work in the core investment programme was just not going to work. By that point in early 2018, I think that the Amy's current rate of replacement was limited to around 2 or 3 trees per week, and at that point we would expect to spend a further 2.5 years on site to replace the remaining 250 or so trees identified within the core investment programme. It just wasn't a viable option. The police had become involved at that point because the injunctions were taking effect. They were getting dragged into this from a broader reputational perspective. It wasn't really calming the situation. Really, that was just providing more ammunition for those who were campaigning against it, further increasing the profile. And I think there were a range of factors that were all coming to a head at that point that led me and Eddie Coates-Madden, who was the head of communications at the time, to conclude that we needed to have a very serious conversation about trying to find a different way forward and to sort of reset the thinking around how we might approach this. More parochially, it was an almost impossibly difficult communications environment to work within. Anything that we were trying to do or say as an organisation became linked to trees issues, and we were very concerned. We just weren't getting a fair hearing on anything from any of the kind of local or national media outlets, and that was just causing it wasn't about the communications team or the communications function, but it was causing us a major headache at that point in time. So there were a number of things coming together that led to the development of that note.
Okay, so one of the things I'm guessing was the confrontations that were visible to everybody on the streets of the city in January. Is that right? I mean, my impression is that made a significant. Yeah. Okay. Very good. So you cogitated over this as I think would be right for a little while, and wrote a paper and provided advice on it in early March 2018. Would you like to set out for us your proposals, basically your views on the mediation process? Well, firstly, that your proposals, what you're proposing, but then tell us a bit about the design of the mediation itself, its conduct, and what it achieved.
Yeah. Okay. So that, as we've said, that note made a number of points that the replacement programme was turning into a bit of a war of attrition on the ground with no real end sight in point. That's having financial, delivery, and reputational impact, and that was becoming unsustainable and impacting upon almost everything else that we seek to do as an organisation or as a city. And I said then, in terms then of both the continued operational obstruction and the damage being done to both the organisation and the city reputation, it might now be worth considering a change of approach. And I went through a number of options in that paper, actually, and I won't go through all of those, but the fourth option we presented, and the one that we suggested being our preferred option, was mediation. And what we said there was that we might be able to bring the council, Amy, and the protesters together to come up with some sort of agreement. We were worried at that point. I think it's fair to say that we can't know who represents the protesters, whether we could make any agreement stick, but actually the process of going through mediation would in itself be hopefully be seen as a positive step forward, and would give us what I described as some moral authority moving forward. That note was still very much cast in a them and us mindset, I think it's fair to say, and that was quite reflective of how I think both sides viewed things at that point after such a long, protracted and divisive campaign. It's not language that I particularly want to use today. I'm not sure that I really held out any great hope at that point that we would quickly be able to enter into mediation. But I think both Eddie and I felt that we had to do something that was going to try to shift the dial a bit in terms of the thinking internally. And as I've said, I don't doubt that there were similar conversations going on within the campaign groups, because I think that it's clear from some of the evidence that that you've heard that this was becoming a very kind of protracted and hard thing for them to continue to do, and that they probably wanted to see some resolution to that as well. So there was a bit of a coming together of perspectives. So in terms of the mediation process itself, I think what I would say is that Councillor Dagnall was appointed Cabinet Member in May 2018 following the local elections, and that resulted in, or was symbolic and symptomatic of, a change in thinking that was going on politically at the same time, and that politically there was also that sense of needing to move towards resolution as opposed to continuing with the programme as originally envisaged. And that's not intended at all to be critical of Councillor Lodge, who I think it was clear was walking an extremely difficult line between different lines of thought politically, but also in terms of the sort of contractual position, and perhaps just didn't have the same room for manoeuvre available to him that Lewis did when he became Cabinet Member, and perhaps also needed a bit of a change of personnel given the history that had developed by that point. I think the other thing to say is that Amy's mindset about what they might be able to achieve within the contract and the costs that they were incurring themselves in terms of trying to push through the original programme was also beginning to shift. Nevertheless, there was a change when Lewis took over. He began opening lines of communications with the campaign groups that hadn't been present for some time. Some of those early conversations were with members and officers, led mainly by Paul Billington. I was involved in some of those discussions. They were challenging and difficult, and there was a huge gulf between what the protesters wanted to see and our position. But the important thing at that stage was that they were happening. So it was in the early part of the summer, so that would be the first few weeks of Lewis's tenure as Cabinet Member, that I think we began discussing the idea of mediation more seriously. I can't recall actually now the precise details of those discussions, and I think it was probably as I said, one of those emergent things that have been floating around for some while. But Lewis discussed and agreed the prospect of mediation with the leader of the council before suggesting it to stag representatives, and the leader was supportive of that. I think it's fair to say as well that there was some considerable suspicion about the motivation for this on all sides, but I think we all recognise that the prospect of mediation represented a step forward, if nothing else. There was quite a lot of discussion that I recall about who would lead the mediation. There was agreement quite early on about the involvement of the Bishop of Sheffield in that, but due to other commitments it was clear that he couldn't be fully involved during the days put aside for the initial round of talks, and so whilst he was going to act as honorary chair, there was a need for somebody else to sort of do a lot of the groundwork, if you like. So it was at that point that we put forward to Stag the idea of a professional mediator or dispute resolution professional. I think Stag would have preferred to have somebody who was well versed in highways and arboricultural matters, but I think our view was very much that it was the professional mediation skills that we were lacking and that were going to be needed if this were to be successful. So we ended up appointing Fiona Colquhoun, and I spent a lot of time during the summer discussing and planning how that session would run, and I don't intend to go into the detail of the kind of mechanics of the session themselves, and I think you've got some information about that. But what I do want to say is that in parallel, Paul Billington had been working with Amy on a different approach to the remaining trees left in in the core investment period, and we intended to present that to Stag during the mediation as a kind of a significant step and a concession on our part. And that proposal effectively placed each of the remaining trees in one of three categories. Either they would be retained indefinitely, there would be a phased removal, or there would be immediate removal. And I think it's important to recognise and emphasise that that was a major concession on the part of the Council and Amy, because it required us to accept suboptimal highway solutions, such as permitting missing curbs. It required Amy to agree to pay for all of those changes and the future sort of make and mend repairs for the duration of the contract. And it required the tacit approval of the Department for Transport for the changes, and that provided the basis of the talks that we wanted to have with Stag. And actually I don't think the mediation would have progressed as well as it did do if we didn't have that as something that we could bring forward and propose to them. Stag had a wider set of issues. Some were historical, some concerned with the programme of works, and some concerned with the future, which they set out in a detailed position statement. I'm not best placed to go through that. I'm sure that's something that you can talk to them about in more detail. I think it's fair to say that the first few days of talks that we had in the September were hard. There was significant mistrust on all sides, really, and there were some pretty heated exchanges that went on as part of that mediation process. But we made some progress. We clarified some misunderstandings on both sides. Stag talked about their concerns and their frustrations, and we presented our new proposals. And we put across some of the frustrations and the issues that we'd had with the way in which Stag carried out the campaign of action that they had been doing. Fair to say, at the end of that first set of talks in the late summer, there wasn't really anything concrete to show for it, except importantly an agreement that we were going to continue talking, and that to me was the real benefit from this. So we held a second set of talks in October, and those talks had a clearer set of objectives that we worked up with Fiona as the mediator, to produce some sort of plan or framework that both sides could share with their stakeholders and their constituents, and to work through a shorter list of issues that we had more or less arrived at by that point, namely the SCC proposal, the idea of a street tree strategy, some issues to do with the contractual relationship between SCC, Amy and the Department for Transport, and indeed the idea of an inquiry or review. Those talks in October ended with an ad hoc joint press conference outside the venue to announce that we'd found a way forward in principle on some of those key issues. And that to me felt like a pretty substantial breakthrough. We didn't agree on everything, not least whether or not there should be an inquiry, which is slightly ironic given where we are today, but anyway. We did reach an understanding on most of the issues that we had, including, importantly from our perspective, verbal acceptance from Stag about the principles of the revised approach that we were suggesting, and the discussion was more about which category each tree should be placed in rather than the principle of the approach itself. It wasn't done and dusted at that point, and I think you've got a copy of a note that I wrote about a week or so after the conclusion of the final set of mediated talks, which talked about there still being some pretty clear blue water between the Council and Amy position and the Stag position on some issues, and not having an agreed written deal at that point. I mean, I think it's clear from that document quite how suspicious we were about some of the intentions and motives of Stag, and actually the ability of their leadership to convince their membership that that was a good way forward. But it did include in that note some options about how we might proceed, including unilateral imposition of the revised proposal, which wasn't our preferred option, but we sort of had that in our back pocket. I think again what was important though was that that process of dialogue and communication continued after the end of the November talks and resulted in the publication of the joint position statement or joint declaration in December 2018, which you will have a copy of. That wasn't it wasn't the end of the dispute, but for me it certainly marked the beginning of the end of it. And I think if we hadn't done that, gone through that process of mediation, it's not clear to me that we would have been able to reach a resolution, and I'm not sure what would have happened at that point.
Okay. One of the other things, of course, that was contextually relevant was that since the 26th of March there'd been a pause on the tree replacement programme, which helped, I think you would agree, in significantly reducing the temperature over a period of months. Now we're going to need to accelerate a little bit because, as you know, I've got someone waiting. It's all right, but we've covered the most important issues that I wanted to ask you about. But let me just run and ask you if you wouldn't mind being a little bit more summary. We're happy to have other material from you if you don't have a chance in the next few minutes to cover everything you wanted to say on these topics. But firstly, any quick observations you can offer on the work of the Street Tree Partnership, which you referred to just now, and what it's achieved, and whether there are more things that need to be done to maximise its effectiveness?
So I'm not particularly involved in the Street Tree Partnership, so I don't have too much to say about it. I think all I would say is that from afar it feels to me as though it's achieved a great deal considering where we were back in the early part of 2018. There is lots of good work that's been done. I don't doubt that there are some difficult, challenging conversations. I know not everything has progressed exactly as might have been envisaged, but the idea of Sheffield becoming a tree city of the world felt quite a long way away from where we were back in 2018. So I think both of the chairs that the Street Tree Partnership have had have worked wonders really in terms of the depth and the trust that has been able to be built up through that process. So I think that's probably all I want to say.
Okay, I will ask one or two other people that, but thank you. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about the quality of information put into the public domain by different teams across the council during the dispute, including the effect of some of that on public trust and what the council has tried to do since then? I mean, you alluded to this effectively earlier. Is there anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, so I don't think that at any point there was ever any intention for the communications that we put out about the Street Tree replacement part of the programme to mislead or that weren't sort of factually accurate. But I think it's fair to say that we made things pretty difficult for ourselves at various points in time. I think there were some things said at the beginning of the dispute that really tied us up in knots for the remainder of the programme that we found really hard to explain. So I've sort of touched briefly on the engineering solutions point and the extent to which they were or weren't funded from within the contract and how they could be deployed, and I think that became really hard for us to explain. That was one of the things that made things more difficult than they might be. I think we weren't ever able really to get on the front foot on our communications, and there was a pattern of events occurring that we ended up having to respond to. So that might have been something like Rustlings Road or material that was released through Freedom of Information requests that made that harder. And sort of when we were trying to get a more proactive message out there about what we were doing, I think we sort of found ourselves being sort of brought back to some of these particular point issues that was hard. I think it's important to credit the Stag campaign. It was slick and effective, and they could say some things that we couldn't as a public authority, including some things that were quite difficult for us. So the whole point about the target of street trees being removed, which I think they later recognised as not being the council's intention, but kept talking about, and we found very difficult to refute. I think it's fair to say that some of the information that did go into the public domain was pretty baffling. including the updates to tree management strategy, and in the hindsight, very unhelpful decisions to create public versions of some of those things that was intended to make them more understandable, but I think only led to more mistrust. And there are also various points where information that we believed had been lost or deleted that later then kind of came to light, and trying to kind of explain that, and it made us look secretive, and again, very hard to rebut some of that. We put out a wide variety of press releases, myth-busting pieces, etc., that were, I absolutely believe, accurate according to the information that we had at the time. We had an embedded communications officer within the highways team. They understood and knew what was going on the ground intimately and got the information directly from that team. So I don't think there was any sense that through those pieces we were trying to do anything that wasn't fully fact-checked and approved. But equally, I would say that some of what we said during the dispute was contradictory or indeed somewhat partial, and I think that probably had a negative impact on trust with the public. And added to that is that we didn't communicate early when we might have been able to do so. I've talked about Rustings Road, I'm not going to go back over that. So we've done a lot since then to try to rebuild trust. We've undertaken significant whole city and more local work in terms of gaining the views of local people. Got the big city conversation that we did in 2019, work with the new local area committees to develop new community plans. I think we learned some of the lessons of the communications approach from trees during the COVID pandemic, and we adopted a very much more open communications approach at that point that I think really helped to build trust and confidence, particularly with communities who were perhaps not as trusting of authority, and we're continuing that now. We don't always get it right, I'd be the first to say that, but I think generally we've made a good step forward since that point. And we're not perfect, as I said, by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we do have an approach that is now based more on doing with than doing to.
Yeah, okay. So there were a couple of other things I was going to ask you about. In fact, I'm going to ask other people about them next week. So I will, I think we'll close at that point, James, if it's okay. If there are things that you would like to tell me that you'd prepared to say on the last two topics that I'd flagged to you, please do let me know. But I want to thank you very much indeed. You've been extremely candid and open and thoughtful and insightful. And I really appreciate all the effort I can see you've gone to in preparing for today and the constructive approach you've taken to the discussion with me. So thank you very much indeed. And at that point we will close the hearing. Charles, thank you.